Shonen, 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 but we'll get back to that one later. Shonen, 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 shonen. This graphic right here shows the top 10 best-selling manga of 2024. 8 shonen, 2 seinen. Of these seinen manga, Kingdom is a classic on par with One Piece in terms of popularity in Japan. Since 2014, only Kingdom and One Piece have made this top 10 list every single year. But the second seinen on this list, the Apothecary Diaries, this one is a bit different. You see, the Apothecary Diaries is not only the top-selling seinen for 2024 and 2025 so far, it is also objectively the first seinen manga in history to break this top 10 list with a solo female lead. And that, in a genre traditionally dominated by big buff-neck niggas, is a very interesting phenomenon. I want to understand how something like this happened. I want to understand why something like this happened. I want to understand how the demographic of anime that was built on straight testosterone and hands ended up dominated by a character that doesn't have testosterone or hands. Hi, damn, my fault. I want to explore how the Apothecary Diaries was able to defy seinen tradition and still reach the heights that it has, at least numbers wise. And so in order to do that, we're going to take a look way back at the roots of seinen stories and slowly work our way up, decade by decade, hero by hero, until we can understand how the title of world's best-selling hero for men ended up in the hands of a young woman. So let's start off with the OG, Big Unk, if you will. To kick things off, we're going to head all the way back to 1968, before 99% of y'all watching right now were even born. Hell, this shit came out before my mom was even born, and despite it being old as hell, it's actually somehow still running to this day, which technically makes it the single longest running manga of all time. On top of it being long as hell, or perhaps due to it being long as hell, this manga, like the Apothecary Diaries, has also made its way atop a bestseller list. But unlike the Apothecary Diaries, which has found its way to the top of 2 yearly bestseller lists, this particular manga has cemented itself at 3rd place on the best-selling manga of all time list. Every now and then I'll discover a series like 𝙏𝙏𝙏 13, which reminds me of just how much different our Western manga market is than the market over in Japan. It almost reminds me of like seeing a McDonald's menu from another country that has a whole new set of menu options unlocked that you've never even seen before. I mean, 𝙏𝙏𝙏 13, which is broadly considered to be the first successful seinen ever, has technically outsold the likes of DBZ, Naruto, Demon Slayer, AOT, and damn near every other manga that you can name except for this one. And yet, if you ask a nigga about his thoughts on that new chapter of 𝙏𝙏𝙏, he's probably finna look at you like I'm looking at you right now since you didn't hit that subscribe button yet. Please? Thank you. 𝙏𝙏𝙏 13 follows the story of this dude right here, Duke Togo, aka 𝙏𝙏𝙏 13. Now Duke, okay, I want you to imagine Agent 47 from the Hitman games, then combine him with John Wick, 2018 LeBron, and fucking the Batman. Yeah, that's the best way I can go about describing Duke Togo. Duke is a borderline superhuman assassin in a world full of borderline superhuman assassins, except the twist is that Duke is just better. You know how to scrap? Duke scraps better. You know how to shoot? Duke shoots better. You know how to fuck? Yeah, you get the idea. Duke fucks a lot, by the way. It's like kind of a thing. He consistently fucks the women he's supposed to assassinate and then proceeds to assassinate them, which is kind of crazy now that I think about it, but anywho, Duke Togo and 𝙏𝙏𝙏 13 are basically the perfect embodiment of where seinen stories began. They were simple, bare-bones stories aimed at the then untapped niche of grown men who wanted more violence and more titties in their manga. Uncle Duke doesn't have a backstory. He's just fucking cool. He doesn't really get bogged down in the morality that comes with taking a life. He just kills niggas for a lot of money and looks fucking cool while doing it. I'd say the overarching, lasting character trait that Duke Togo and his commercial success injected into the lifeblood of seinen stories was this sort of rugged stoicism. Now, whether or not future stories decided to fall in line with or subvert these stoic ideals kind of varies from story to story, but I think it's pretty telling that every major seinen hero that I can think of itself post-Golgo kinda plays with this sort of Togo-esque stoicism in one way or another. Even Mao Mao, damn near 60 years after Togo, still has elements of this Sane fortitude etched into her character. Sure, she might not be tanking explosions or point-blank bullets to the back. Togo actually did that shit, by the way. Took a hollow point to the back meat and walked that motherfucker off like a goddamn bug bite. Fucking ridiculous, man. But anywho, even though Mao Mao's not taking hollows to the back with a straight face, she did literally lock in through like actual human trafficking without uttering a single complaint. And if that's not damn near Togo level stoicism, then shit, maybe I just don't know what stoicism is. Now, Golgo 13 and its themes of unwavering resilience were undoubtedly the prototype for the modern seinen hero. Togo was unstoppable, but that's kinda all he was. Big, buff, tough, gruff, and really fucking horny. However, none of that really mattered back in the day. You see, Togo wasn't just a drop in the bucket when it came to this stoic, ultra-masculine character archetype. He was the stoic, ultra-masculine character archetype in the dozens of series, both seinen and shonen, that would spawn in during the following decade. Still kinda had to call Togo by the name of daddy when it came to sales and influence. The early to mid 80s essentially consisted of Duke Togo and a bunch of Duke Togo Jr. running around and being stoic while punching niggas in the chest. Sure, there was some seinen hits like Akira that managed to find success while somewhat breaking the Togo mold, but by and large, for nearly 2 decades, the most successful seinen heroes look like Duke Togo. Cold, stoic, and untouchable. Every hitman, every mercenary, every brooding tough guy, all of them were just new faces on the same blueprint, and that formula worked really well. Until it didn't. By the end of the 80s, readers didn't just want stoic anymore. They didn't just want a hero who was tough for the sake of being tough. It was time for something new. It was time for something that readers could feel, and it wasn't until the very end of the 80s that we would finally meet the seinen hero that would go on to surpass, no, eclipse Duke Togo in terms of influence. Guts, from an aesthetic standpoint, is 100% a Duke Togo clone, alright? If Berserk came out today with modern anime naming conventions, that shit would probably be called some bullshit like Re-Dookie, the time Duke Togo, got reincarnated into a fantasy world with the fucking coolest sword ever conceived by mankind. Or some shit like that, I don't know. On the surface, Guts' character falls perfectly in line with the 80s Togoisms of his time. He's a big, buff, brooding, hyper-competent badass that will let literally nothing stand between him and his mission objectives. He kills, he fucks, not as much as Togo, but yeah, he's just kinda all around that guy. I'd even go as far as to say that Guts' insane resilience through his very tragic life is the direct result of Togo having been the unstoppable force that came before him. Remember, at the end of the day, manga is still a product, and like any product, if you want to succeed as a newcomer, it's probably in your best interest to follow trends and play to the demands of your audience before you go trying to innovate and experiment with new things. I like to imagine that Kentaro Miura, the author of Berserk, was well aware of the type of audience he was trying to capture during the early 90s. Berserk's first arc, the Black Swordsman arc, reads like a slightly angstier fantasy version of Golgo 13. Just a big, buff, tenacious, angry nigga going around and fucking shit up because it looks cool, and I'm not gonna lie, that shit was still cool as hell. What makes Guts different from his predecessors, however, and what makes Berserk matter in the long run when it comes to characters like Mao Mao, is what Miura did with Guts' story after that opening arc. As the 90s moved forward and Guts' story continued to unfold, Miura shifted gears with his storytelling, reshaping Berserk from a brutal, masculine-ass power fantasy into the emotional, once-in-a-generation character study that we know it as today. Through witnessing Guts' backstory in the Golden Age arc, we as readers begin to understand why that boy Guts was a buff tweaker during the Black Swordsman arc. And this alone separated Guts from the likes of Duke, since Duke, again, quite notably, just didn't have a backstory. As the story of Berserk continued to progress and grow in popularity, it would brick by brick lay down the very framework that a lot of modern seinen like the Apothecary Diaries still stand on to this day. Seinen's knack for brain over brawn when it comes to antagonists, shout out Berserk for that. Every seinen MC ever having a narrative arc surrounding overcoming their traumatic backstory, shout out Berserk for that. Women, shout out Berserk for that. Did y'all know that women actually did not exist before Berserk? Shout out Berserk, man, so inspirational. It might be slightly illegal to talk about the origins of any seinen hero without at least mentioning the greatest to ever do it. And even though I don't see too many direct parallels between Guts and 𝙏𝙗 in the grander scheme of seinen MCs, I do think that the way Miura handled Guts' writing paved the way for a character like 𝙏𝙗 to exist in the first place, because I don't know, man, I feel like if 𝙏𝙗 was still considered the quintessential seinen MC over Guts, we probably would have ended up in an absolutely fucked timeline where bullshit like Solo Leveling can win anime of the year over shows like Frieren or the Apothecary Diaries. Oh wait, if I did have to point out a 90s seinen hero that I think 𝙏𝙗 can more directly trace her roots back to, I'd probably look towards Kenzo Tenma from Monster. I mean, he's kind of the MC that put smart niggas on the map in a genre that had primarily been dominated by meatheads, and I think that Monster's mysterious, psychological tone feels way closer to what the Apothecary Diaries is doing than anything you'd find in 𝙏𝙏 13 or Berserk. But as we moved past Monster in the mid-90s and headed toward the turn of the century, another major shift in seinen was brewing, and this particular shift might have been even more extreme than the last. Now I'm gonna hold your hand while I say this because, look bro, you're 10 minutes deep into a seinen history yap session on YouTube, therefore I know the type of nigga you are, but coming into the early 2000s, we have to talk about women. I know, bro, relax. Women in anime has always been a strange topic to broach, and perhaps in no demographic is this truer than it is in the seinen demographic. You see, most men are sexually attracted to women, meaning that if you want to sell seinen manga, it's probably a good idea to include women in your story to some degree. However, by that same vein, if your main reason for including women in your shit is so that your audience gets bricked up while reading, you're probably not gonna write the best women from a characterization perspective. Pair this with the fact that seinen is like one of the 2 manga demographics where you can see uncensored titties relatively frequently, and you end up with almost like this double-sided coin of a genre, where on one end, you have some of the best written, most beloved women in all of anime, and on the other end, I'm not gonna lie, that shit is kinda spooky, bro. Anywho, I bring all that up to drive home the point that writing women for a seinen audience is no simple task, which honestly makes the Apothecary Diaries hitting the top 10 list twice that much more impressive. But the Apothecary Diaries finally bringing women to the forefront of seinen manga, as groundbreaking as it is, was not a task that 𝙏𝙗 accomplished alone. In fact, like another green-haired, freckled MC that I know, I reckon 𝙏𝙗 would have never been able to reach the level of success that she had without first standing on the shoulders of a bunch of heroes that came before her. In terms of seinen stories, the early 2000s is an era that I like to call the side chick era of seinen. You see, the early 2000s was actually a pretty decent time for seinen women, at least compared to how things had been in the years prior. For what was essentially the first time in the history of the genre, stories that centered around female characters were not only dropping, but also gaining some pretty decent traction. Series like Black Lagoon, Jörmungand, and Elfen Lied are probably some of the biggest names to come out of this largely forgotten era of manga. Just like you forgot to hit that subscribe button, and all of these series, at least to a degree, happen to be centered around female characters in a way that we hadn't really seen much in seinen manga up until this point. But you see, I want you to pay attention to my wording of that last statement, right? Notice how I said that these stories were centered around women. What I did not say, however, is that they were led by women, and this is kind of where the whole side chick dynamic that I was talking about earlier starts to come into play. The side chick model is essentially when an author creates a very cool female character that for all intents and purposes is the MC in terms of plot relevance and marketing, but then proceeds to relegate said MC into a deuteragonist role in favor of a milf milquetoast ass nigga that a primarily male audience can self-insert into. Honestly, it's a pretty common and successful method I see being played even to this day in a lot of romance anime, but to me it's always been a sign that these authors don't really trust niggas to lock in with a female MC, which like, I kinda don't blame them. I don't really have a problem with this method in general. I think if executed correctly, it can actually enhance a story, i.e. the relationship between Revy and Rock in Black Lagoon. I just also think that it's only fair to call a spade and point out the fact that niggas are not watching Black Lagoon for Rock. They're watching because they fantasize about getting their asses beat by one of these three ladies. But yeah, in general, during the early 2000s, anime fans would finally begin to see way more women in Sane who were just as important and capable as their male counterparts. Sure, they may have fallen into slightly fan servicey territory every now and then, but like, I mean, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. The early 2000s also came with an influx of female authors throwing their hats into the ring of seinen authorship. Stories like Dorohedoro, Land of the Lustrous, and March Came In Like a Lion were all actually written by women, and even though none of these stories have garnered the massive level of success that series like the Apothecary Diaries have, they all have pretty strong core audiences, as well as a pretty high level of acclaim from those who have experienced their stories. This uptrend of women being important to, but not quite leading the most popular seinen manga would continue all the way through the mid-2010s and into the late 2010s, when the Apothecary Diaries manga adaptation was published in Square Enix's monthly Big Gangan magazine. However, I think before we talk about the Apothecary Diaries itself, we have to talk about the landscape of seinen manga that the Apothecary Diaries was coming into, particularly as it relates to an event that I like to call the singularity. Like its younger brother Shonen, most popular series in seinen have always been the battle series. The series with the fights, the series with the scraps, the series where good squabbles against evil with fists or swords, or insert various types of magical fireballs here. The main difference between popular shonen and popular seinen, at least historically, has always been the tone. The idea being that because seinen was aimed at a more adult audience, the tone of seinen series could be a bit more mature as well. Through the seinen label, authors could tell stories that maybe didn't have that upbeat friendship is magic sort of feel to it. Seinen got darker, seinen got gorier, seinen got nudity than shonen did, and back in the day, these differences in tone and aesthetics were some of the main aspects that set seinen apart from shonen. And then the 2010s happened. During the 2010s, we began to see a very interesting evolution in the demographics of the shonen audience. According to the premier shonen publication themselves, Shonen Jump, as of 2019, 53.2% of their readers were over the age of 19, meaning that as of 2019, adults actually make up a slight majority of the audience for Shonen Jump magazine. Now, if we take these numbers and extrapolate them across the rest of the industry, which we technically shouldn't do, but bro, this is a YouTube video, not a research paper. I'll skew the numbers however I see fit to make my point, and you don't care enough to do the research to challenge me, so you know, let's just work with me here. But if we take these numbers and use them as a representation of shonen as a whole, what these numbers essentially tell us is that the kids who fell in love with the big three in the early 2000s never really aged out of the shonen demographic. They simply continued to adopt each new generation shonen series that came out, slowly dragging the median age for shonen consumers up with them as they advanced through their teen and young adult years. And yeah, I can say pretty confidently, as one of these kids who grew up in this demographic, that shit definitely did happen. Now, I don't really know if this age up phenomenon happened because shonen stories got more mature, or if shonen stories got more mature because this age up phenomenon happened. It's honestly somewhat of a chicken and egg situation that would probably warrant its own separate video, but regardless of which particular phenomenon caused which, the key takeaway here is that in the 2010s, a lot of what made seinen ended up being adopted by shonen stories. Series like Jujutsu Kaisen and Hell's Paradise feel like borderline seinen thanks to their bleak weaker tone paired with their cast that skews older in age. Hell, I'd argue that the only thing keeping Chainsaw Man from just straight up being a seinen is the fact that we haven't explicitly seen nipples in that series yet. And for those of y'all who read the manga, you know that we've already seen something that's arguably far more explicit than just some nipples. The 2010s was important to the Apothecary Diaries, not just because it was the decade that it started publishing, but also because of the singularity that happened between Battle Shonen and Battle Seinen, which essentially left a vacuum in the world of seinen. A vacuum that come September 2017, the Apothecary Diaries would go on to fill. This brings us to the present, the 2020s, an era of seinen now ruled by the story of a young woman and her clever escapades within the royal court of ancient China. 𝙏𝙖𝙡 is an interesting character to hold the title of world's best-selling seinen hero, because if you actually do your homework on 𝙏𝙏's origins, you'll come to realize that old girl was never really meant to be a seinen hero in the first place. You see, the Apothecary Diaries anime is an adaptation of a manga, which is an adaptation of a light novel, which is an adaptation of a web novel. So this story, as most of the audience knows it at least, is actually an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation of a story that was damn near 12 years in the making. If you go back to the OG source material and look over it as it was originally published, you'll notice that 1, 𝙏𝙏 looked way better in her original design, and 2, the series was initially labeled as a mystery series by its author, and it didn't really get branded with this seinen title until 2 iterations down the line, when the manga adaptation just so happened to be picked up by Square Enix's Sane magazine. In other words, 𝙏𝙏 was just a really good character that just so happened to be imbued with this larger than life title of seinen hero. Once again, like Deku getting his one for all quirk 15 years after being born. I think all in all, 𝙏𝙏 is the perfect vessel for this title, right? From a character perspective, she fits perfectly into the seinen mold, all while being aesthetically different enough from traditional seinen heroes that she feels like a genuine evolution of the genre. I can't stress enough how fire it is that after 50 years, we're finally seeing a woman rule over what I feel like personally is the best genre of anime, and I can't wait to see what comes from 𝙏𝙏's reign in the next decade or two, because I'm gonna tell you now, and you can say you heard it here first, the future of seinen is women, but, okay, and hear me out, buff women.